Because understanding great literature is better than trying to read and understand yet another business book. On the Leadership Lessons from the Great Books podcast, we commit to reading, dissecting, and analyzing the great books of the Western canon. You know, those books, from Jane Austen to Shakespeare, and everything else in between, that you might have fallen asleep trying to read in high school. We do this for our listeners, the owner, the entrepreneur, the manager, or the civic leader who doesn't have the time to read, dissect, analyze, and leverage insights from literature to execute leadership best practices in the confusing and chaotic postmodern world we all now inhabit. Welcome to the rescuing of Western civilization at the intersection of literature and leadership. Welcome to the Leadership Lessons from the Great Books podcast. Hello, my name is Hassan Sorrells, and this is the Leadership Lessons from the Great Books podcast, episode number 94 in chronological order. I always have to say that, but eventually we're going to get to, episode number 100, and then I'll stop saying that, and then you can go back and find those archived episodes. With our book today, an exploration of the challenges that are inherent in living in a pre-civil rights United States of America as a Black man. This is a book that engages readers around the psychological question of how a Black man can position himself in a world replete with racism and racial injustice that the postmodern, post-Civil Rights Act leadership mind can barely contemplate. And when it does seek to contemplate such a world, usually such contemplation results in an existential shudder at best and an attempt to grift off the past at worst. This narrative, strangely enough, proposes a simple solution to our current complicated cultural mess surrounding gender, sexuality, sexual orientation, and even how the facts of those identities are negotiated in the overall social order. I'm going to drop a clue here a little bit in the beginning. Say my name, to paraphrase from Breaking Bad. Today, we will summarize, analyze, and potentially even read selections from Ralph Ellison's Invisible Man. And today we will be joined in this literary journey at the start of Black History Month in the United States of America with our returning guest / sparring partner from last year's episode number 49, where we covered The Souls of Black Folk by W.E.B. Du Bois, my good friend and a good friend of the show, Dorollo Nixon Jr., and as usual, I have to put this on the end, Esquire. How you doing, Dorollo?
Great, sir. Good morning. Great to be here.
This is a great day for us to begin our exploration of The Invisible Man and how that book has impacted us, not only as Black people in America, but also has impacted a lot of how we think about racial politics in America. And we're going to talk a little bit about the literary life of Ralph Ellison as well, because he defied easy categorization, much to the chagrin of writers who followed him, such as it were. So today we're going to do something a little bit different. We're going to try a little bit of a different sort of format. So normally at this point, I would pick up and I would read from Invisible Man directly. But today we're going to summarize a little bit. We're going to kind of go back and forth. I would encourage you to pick up a copy of Invisible Man. And as usual, as I always say, there's Dorollo's copy. As usual, as I always say, we will not be reading from the whole book because we can't possibly do that. There's too much depth here. There's too much content. There's too many things going on. It is a quick read, and it is a deceptively deep read once you get into it. So I would like to point out, though, that the the prologue, which is where everything sort of begins, its setup, begins with the line, "I am an invisible man." Then the narrator goes on to tell you that he is not someone that is like Edgar Allan Poe or like some Hollywood fiction. He's not made of ectoplasmic stuff, right? He's not someone that you can see through. However, he is a person. He is solid, but he is living in a society where his presence is invisible. He tells in the prologue a brief anecdote about running into a white man. And this is where you first get the idea that he may not necessarily be white, right? And assaulting him. And that assault leads him to hide in a basement, kind of like a hobbit hole, right? A quote unquote warm hole in Harlem, a place of incandescent light bulbs and ripped off electricity from Con Ed. From this, we are to conclude, obviously, like I said, that he is a black man because all of the social signals have been provided by Ellison. And we are to conclude also that he is suffering from the impacts of societal-wide discrimination and Jim Crow. But, as is about to be revealed from Ellison, all is not what it seems. When we think about Ralph Ellison and we think about The Invisible Man, we have to kind of think about his life. And so he was born on March 1st, 1913, and he died on April 16th of 1994. So he lived a long, long life. He lived a life before the Civil Rights Movement, and was a man who saw 2 generations out the actual impacts of slavery and the subsequent Jim Crow era in the South, as well as saw the impacts of the sharecropping and the immense poverty that existed in the South at the time. He was, of course, and this is how he defined himself, fundamentally an American writer, a literary critic, and a scholar. He was born in Oklahoma and was the second of 3 sons. His oldest brother died in infancy. His father, Lewis Alfred Ellison, was a small business owner and a construction foreman who died in 1916 when Ellison was just 3 years old after an operation to cure internal wounds suffered after shards from a 100-pound ice block penetrated his abdomen, failed, and he died. Died from something that he probably would have lived through if he had been born a little bit later. Ellison's mother, Ida Millsap, remarried 3 times after Lewis's death and encouraged Ralph Waldo Ellison to play the trumpet, which later allowed him admittance to the Tuskegee Institute in 1933 when he was 20 years old. Ellison's experiences at Tuskegee with class-conscious Black people, and I want to talk a lot about this today, caused him to sharpen his satirical lens, according to writer and theater critic Hilton Als. But the education he received there, including being exposed to T.S. Eliot's The Wasteland, lit the spark of writing in him, and he moved away from merely playing music to beginning to write. Now, Invisible Man was his only completed novel and was published in 1952 to endless critical acclaim, and he did win the National Book Award. But subsequently, Ellison never published another novel to the level of Invisible Man ever again. So there's a lot of stuff here, right? From the book, from the narrative, from Ellison himself. And it leads us down this road, and we're going to open up with Dorollo here. It leads us down this road of having to really place Ellison in a particular spot, having to talk about the pre-civil rights African-American conception. And I don't really like that term African-American, but we're going to use it probably interchangeably with Black American today. But the pre-civil rights Black American perception of themselves versus the post-civil rights Black American perception of themselves. And of course, it creates tensions for us McWhorter or not Glenn McWhorter, sorry, Glenn Lowry and John
John
McWhorter.
McWhorter the fourth, right?
Fourth, right?
Order the fourth, something like that.
Exactly.
Yeah.
That's right.
Always got to throw that fourth in there.
Got to throw the fourth in there.
Yep.
Dorollo's a big fan of the numbering. It creates tensions that Lowry and McWhorter have explored for the last over 10 years on their podcast as well, about what it actually means to be Black in America. And so Ellison touches on all of this. So let's open up with Dorollo.
Oh, he's the fifth. My bad.
He had to look.
Yes,
It's the fifth.
I wanted to make sure I was correct, and I was incorrect. Yes.
So Dorollo, tell me about Ellison's Invisible Man. I know you've read this book before. I know you revisited it for the podcast.
No.
Okay.
I had read parts of Juneteenth before, and it's a shame because I have a degree in English Lit from Cornell. My concentration was the modern novel, and so my focus. I spent time.
How did you miss this?
Exactly. I spent time, and it's an important question. I spent time focused on Joyce. I spent time focused on some other works and not this one. And it's interesting because I took an American novel course that went through like the rise of Silas Lapham and Babbitt and these other, great weighty works. And it's a shame because I think this is a masterwork. There's a truly majestic flow to what he presents. And it's worth struggling through more than 500 pages. I have no idea why you called it an easy read. I didn't find it so, but I find it profound, and his insights profound. It is a disturbing snapshot of, pre-civil rights America. And while I'm excited by how New York, which is where Nameless, because that's what I call him, goes, I'm encouraged in certain respects to opportunities he found in New York, and cultural DNA that still plays out in that city today in ways that are both beautiful and disturbing, are there, from the concentration of Black people in Harlem and Manhattan and nowhere else, to the use of taxis to get around, and then the subtle interplay between driver and passenger. And I don't know how Uber changes that, or Lyft, but I assume it does, because now there's not this, it's a much larger subculture, and there's less cultural dynamics, I think, with Uber and Lyft than there are with taxi drivers. A taxi driver is a thing,
Mm-hmm.
Anyway. But certainly of the Jim Crow South, and of, Nameless's forlorn little oasis that literally comes apart at the seams by turning down the wrong street. And literally you go from pristine, neoclassical architectured, manicured lawns.
Don't give it away too much. Don't give it away too much, because I want to focus on some of this in our sort of third section on Dr. Bledsoe.
Oh, okay, good. Yes.
Because I do want to get into that in a little bit here. I mean, you could do this. Let's do the setup. Let's let folks know where we're going. But that right there is, I think Dr. Bledsoe is the critical linchpin character in this novel. For a whole variety of reasons.
I got stuck on Lynch because here it has, great resonance.
It does. It does.
Yeah, it does.
Okay. So you had not read. This is interesting. I figured you had touched on Ellison, at least. Ellison, Richard Wright, who we're going to be covering this month.
Richard Wright, yes, but Richard Wright was actually high school. They were doing their job. So Richard Wright was either the end of middle school or the beginning of high school. Yeah.
Okay. And then
of course, I think it was middle school. I think it was 8th grade.
Okay.
Yeah.
And then of course the anti Richard Wright and the anti Ellison, my man James Baldwin.
Yep.
Ooh, definitely. We're going to be bringing you back at the end of the month for Baldwin, to talk about notes from a native son.
Yep.
Okay. So it's interesting to me that you had not run into Ellison before.
Oh no, I ran it. I mean, I knew who he was, certainly.
Right.
But just didn't read. I didn't read anything except Juneteenth, and I didn't read Juneteenth until post Cornell. I don't remember
Okay.
where I was. I don't remember if I was in the North or the South. I don't remember where I was.
Do you think that because Ellison's, and we have to kind of talk a little bit about this, do you think it's because Ellison's politics subtly shifted? And one of the things that I want to reference here is Norman Podhertz's, and I sent you a link to this article as well, Norman Podhertz's article on whatever happened to Ralph Ellison, right?
Mm-hmm.
And Podhertz makes the point, and Podhertz was a leftist 60s Jewish radical, right? Who believed fundamentally that Baldwin was correct, though not a good writer. And Ellison was a good writer, but not necessarily correct. And writing in Commentary magazine in 1999, he kind of doubles down on this idea that Ellison's attempt to be a humanist and a modernist put him at odds with the Black political structure of the middle 20th century, and thus deemed his writing, particularly at an august institution like Cornell, deemed his writing to be verboten. And you double down on that by the fact that Ellison, and we could talk about this early, you double down on that that analysis with the fact that Ellison never published another novel, was never able to complete another novel while he was alive. Juneteenth was completed after his death, and Podhertz calls it basically a cobbled together mess. I'm being friendly, but that's basically what he calls it. 398 pages or something like that out of a potential 2,000 that were actually written. Why do you think Ellison didn't make the Cornell cut?
I mean, he may have. So it's weird. I remember myself. I remember some of my thinking, of course, then, and it's distorted by age. It's distorted by forgetfulness. It's distorted by too much wine, etc. But because of my recollections of my state of mind and state of soul, let's say, I will begin with myself. I'm more inclined to assume it was by my choice than by something that wasn't offered at my, August institution, our alma mater. So I assume it was that. I didn't take very many American literature courses. In high school, in contrast, that's what I was reading, and I ate that stuff for breakfast. It was magnificent. And I remember, feeling, not the exact moment, I think I can see where I was reading one of Hemingway's works the first time I come across Nigger, and I'm just like, here's this betrayal where it's like amazing writing and getting into his quirks and whatever, and then it's like, wait, but this is how you see us. This is what you believe about me and about my race. Oh, well, this isn't good. And so by the time I got to Cornell, I wasn't exactly done with Hemingway, but I think I was more focused in European writers. And of course, at the same time, I ended up studying a lot of comparative literature and French literature at the same time. And I would have majored in comparative literature if I knew what it was before I was a senior. So,
right.
I was taking all this French lit stuff and taking some comparative literature stuff, and then learned, oh, this is what a comparative literature major is like. And then, if I had realized that, I probably would have majored in that. But, who knows? Again, hindsight about childhood and childhood quirks is far better than 2020. Right.
So you talk about, and I'm a fan of Hemingway. I'm also a fan of Mark Twain. And one of the challenges that we have on this podcast is that, or not challenges, one of the opportunities that this podcast opens is the opportunity to talk about hard words, hard ideas, hard thoughts that writers, particularly in an American, and you talk about European, an American in a European context struggle with. So in the European context, European writers like Joyce and and others, and I'm just going to use Joyce because it's the one you mentioned, they struggle with the European conception of self, not necessarily based on race, but a European conception of self based on geography and location in tension with or against colonialism, right? Think of Kipling's White Man's Burden. He's not really referencing race there, although everybody tags him with that. He's actually referencing colonialism primarily and race secondarily. Okay. Oh, don't worry.
Well,
I know he's mixed it all together, but his primary concern was colonialism with Kipling.
Yeah, but okay, so let me push back. Kipling wasn't writing about British colonialism in Ireland, where there's no racial element. And yet the same types of hate and tropes, the same inability, and here relating it to Invisible Man, the same inability to see the other. And I don't just mean as a mass of people not seeing them and seeing them as animals, but an inability to see the other. That played out in British colonialism of Ireland. But
for sure,
where Kipling was focused, of course, was India, right? And the whole India under the Raj. And the thing that really spoiled it, in my opinion, because, and this is, a slightly contentious point, but if you look at Indian history, which I love and I study, the podcasts I listen to the most, one of them is going through the history of India. It's absolutely fabulous. And there's other books, more than one, that I'm reading right now on the history of not just the subcontinent, but the regions surrounding it. You can see a series of empires that existed in India over time, sometimes over centuries each. And empires that foreigners started and led. And so when I see, and hear the animosity directed at the British or at the Raj, I say to among the questions that I have is, okay, so why is this different? Because you got all these other, like, why are you not mad at the Mughals? Okay, you're mad at the British, but not the Mughals. The Mughals weren't Indians, they're from Central Asia. They came in, they conquered. Babur, the first Mughal emperor, right, was from a place called Fergana, and it's just like, where the heck is that? It's I think it's in Uzbekistan. But anyway, point being, this guy's not Indian. Why aren't you mad at the Mughal yoke the way you're mad at the Raj, right? And to me, one of there's more than one answer. One of the answers is because the Raj was the most recent, and it's still in certain people's memories, and there's things like photos and film that show problems. Got it. Okay. And I mean, I assume that there's at least one photograph of the last Mughal emperor because he was around in the middle of the 19th century. So I assume there's at least one photograph of this guy. I forget his name too. But anyway, but that's not, to me, the most important piece. That's just aesthetics. In terms of the substance, the thing that the piece that, well, the chief piece the British got wrong, in my opinion, is that they let the racism infect them such that it then impacted how they did their colonialism. And if they hadn't done that, they might still be there today. There were many ways that they helped bring benefits to the society of South Asia, but it's like the racism poisoned the whole thing. That's how I see it. And so, if they had fought that, I think they would have had a fighting chance to still be there today. They wouldn't have been, ironically enough, they would have been so alien, but it wasn't their alienness itself, because that's how it was with the Kushans. That's how it was with the Mughals. And the Mughals and Kushans over time, and the Mughals certainly, they did some intermarrying. Okay, fine, but they were still viewed, certainly the Kushans still viewed as foreigners. And so it's like, okay, so why are they given a pass? Mughals obviously love, the architecture, all the rest of the stuff, given a pass. But so let's be even more specific. So the Mughals, they were Muslim. So you have this mass of Hindus, and you have Muslim emperors, yet they're given a pass. But then you have these British, far fewer, well, in terms of the administration, probably fewer people, but there's no pass. And I'm just like, okay, so if you want to hold them to the same standards as that you hold Mughals and others, okay, fine. But if you're not going to do that, if you're going to, make these distinctions, like I just, to me, it ruins the critique. But I
So
digress. So
that was a hell of a digression.
yep.
But it triggers a couple of other things that relate to Invisible Man.
And you were talking about Twain. What were you going to say about Twain?
Well, and here's what I was going to say about Twain. So Twain and Hemingway are two of the largest pillars, because the parallel I was drawing was between how Joyce and Faulkner, not Faulkner, Kipling and other European writers approached the tension between being European and being colonialist. And we could compare or contrast that with how Twain, Faulkner as well was a Southern writer. We could throw him in there. What the heck? But the big two are Twain and Hemingway. How they dealt with and addressed the history of racism, either in casual language, in casual commentary, or in casual culture, or in high culture, quite frankly, in America. And the comparison and the contrast between those two is this, and it gets to exactly what you said about religion and the Mongols and the Muslims versus the Indians in a European, in an Indian context. The larger lesson here, I think, is that human beings will divide over anything. They will divide over race, they will divide over religion, they will divide over class. The biggest challenges come not from seeing the division in your own country or in your own backyard, because, I'm sure if we brought on somebody who was from India, they would be able to tell us all of the things, all of the reasons why the Mughals, even though they were Muslim, were great, and the British, to your point, even though they were maybe Christian, were terrible. They would be able to tell us, because human beings are going to divide along those kinds of lines, right? Whereas in America, we struggle merely with the idea of division, because in an American context, we have really doubled and tripled and quadrupled down on the idea that, at least until recently, and I would say recently within the last 20 years, we really doubled and tripled down on this idea of everyone melting together, and there would be no divisions, right? That was the dream, right? Talk about Martin Luther King Jr.'s I Have a Dream. But Twain's writing and Hemingway's writing reveal the fault lines in those dreams. They reveal the reality behind those dreams. And so it is interesting when we are first confronted with those realities that put tension on the myth of America. A lot of people who read Twain, read Hemingway, do exactly what you did. They run away from it because the tension's too much, right? And I was drawing, and the other thing that I was going to say there, in addition, was that I don't run away from those tensions. I actually embrace them, because I think those tensions are worthwhile for us to struggle with. It is an irony above ironies. Not even irony. I wouldn't even say that. It is a triumph of Twain's heart over Twain's reality that a comedy award that has his name on it has now been given to, like, I think 3 or 4 black comics, including most recently Dave Chappelle. I think Mark Twain would love that. There. I think he would love that. I think he would be fine with that, right? I think Hemingway's challenges with black people, or his conception of how race existed in America, didn't really. Here's the dirty little secret. I don't think it meant anything to him. I don't think he thought any more about it than we think about where our cats or our dogs are in our house. I don't think he thought about it in any other that kind of level.
Right. And to me, I agree. To me, it's, well, that's a because he was a racist. So there you go.
Well,
like
and
it
by the
wasn't
way,
an issue.
by the way, you could tag him as a racist.
What did my
and
cat eat today? Don't know, don't care. Gave
don't care.
food.
Right.
Went on with my life, you know.
Well, and here's the thing. Here's the thing that we have to struggle with Ralph Ellison as well. Okay. Ellison, I think, was as a writer rejected because he recognized the racism and he recognized its impact. But I think he thought, and we're moving in this direction on the podcast this year, I think he thought that the solutions to it were worse than the disease.
Okay.
And I think that Hemingway, if you went back in time and showed him the solutions to the disease, would probably agree.
I don't know. To me, where he's best, yeah. So I mean, among the challenges with Ernest Hemingway, well, no, I don't like how that sentence began. When I look at Hemingway's perspective on Black people, there we go. Sure. One of the only bright lights I see, no pun intended, but the only bright lights I see is there's certain ways in which he did, like in the Green Hills of Africa, there's certain ways in which he describes natives with whom, you know, hunting is going on. There's certain ways in which he describes them where you can see some understanding and respect. And of course, the problem that it creates for me as a Black American is that that's not my milieu. Okay, I'm not running around in the savannas of East Africa hunting half naked or clothed helping white men go kill things. Okay, that's
right.
Not how I hunt. That's not how I hunt. But the milieu, the cultural milieu in which I'm in, is one of a shared language, shared history, and shared institutions. And so when in that context, New York, for example, and when in that context, the same respect isn't accorded, where I have to get to the back of the line or just won't be addressed at a party, that's what's infuriating. And so, and you know, I didn't shy away from his works. I still read them. He was a phenomenal writer, and I still think they should be read and taught, you know. And I would do a disclaimer to any teachers listening to the podcast, give a disclaimer and then teach the works. And when you give the disclaimer, don't you dare think of looking at the Black students. Just you give the disclaimer. You may hear things that offend you. We understand that. You're reading these works because these are foundational to American literature. And then you go on and you do it. And then they can, you know, thrill with, you know, some of the best writing in the language that, you know, is most likely their native language in America. And yet, you know, recognize that, hey, some of these concepts aren't good. Some of them are evil. And you're going to read them and you're going to have to learn, as you pointed out, you have to learn to deal with them. You have to learn to wrestle with those things. And if you're not exposed to them, you'll never learn to wrestle with them. And you certainly won't solve problems in a society where you're uncomfortable confronting an uncomfortable reality, you know? And so, but I thought Ellison in this work, I thought he did an absolutely magisterial job with presenting the problems and continuing through, you know, with his tropes and his symbols and things like that are part of how you structure, how a well-structured novel is written, includes things like that. And so, and you can see them, you know, like, and detect them, like cabbage, the smell of cabbage in New York and what it meant for Nameless. And that's just, to me, that was beautifully done. That wasn't as beautifully done as the physical remnants of actual slavery that keep cropping up and that somehow at some point in this novel basically find themselves, as it were, in the same container. And thus, like the Ark of the Covenant, you've got the tablets, you've got Aaron's rod, and you got a pot of manna. And here he's got his shackle, he's got that doll, like it's broken with the coin. And literally, it's just like, that was really well constructed. That was really well constructed. This novel is excellent.
Well, and let me throw in one other thing there, and then we'll go back to the book here. When Ellison initially did his writing, he was writing from the perspective, or not perspective, his first initial efforts at writing copied the voice of, ironically enough, Ernest Hemingway.
Mm-hmm.
And that's where he started. And so The Sun Also Rises was published in the 1920s. Ellison didn't publish Invisible Man until 1952. He was a notoriously slow writer, spent 7 years writing it. And of course, he didn't attend Tuskegee until he was 20 in 1933, where he was first exposed to not only T.S. Eliot, but also would have been exposed to Hemingway and all of those other writers of the modernist era. Back to the book. Back to The Invisible Man by Ralph Ellison. So we're going to skip ahead a little bit, and we're going to go to chapter 5. Now, again, we're doing a little bit of a different thing here. If you want to pick up the book, go ahead and get it. We're not reading directly from the book today. We're doing a little more, as you could tell from what we did during that first sort of piece there, a little more of a deep dive at the literary level and at the leadership level on Invisible Man. So in chapter 5 is an interesting chapter. So this chapter begins following Invisible Man, or as Dorollo has put on him, Nameless. This follows on Nameless's journey through, actually a disastrous trip to the town outside of the university in this unnamed southern state. And the town, the Invisible Man was chauffeuring around a white trustee named Mr. Norton. And Mr. Norton and the Invisible Man wind up in a lower class sharecropper's cabin. And they hear a shocking story of incest and the result of that incest. And as a result of the shock from that story, the Invisible Man chauffeurs Mr. Norton to a bar known as the Golden Day, a bar filled with mental patients.
I thought that was a whorehouse filled with veterans who have mental disease, but okay. But that's what I thought it was. I mean, they got a bar, but they got it upstairs,
Yeah,
right.
I think it was a combo. You talk about the Ark of the Covenant combo. I think it was a combo situation. Yes, some of those people were veterans. Yes, some of the individuals in there were definitely ladies of the night. And
in the middle of the day,
in the middle of the day, the middle of the Golden Day. Exactly. And so Ellison is playing with some tropes here in this chapter, or in the chapter previous to chapter 5. So in chapter 5, Invisible Man is shaken, to say the least. And he's a young student. He's class conscious. You can see that in the engagement with the lower class sharecropper. You can see that in his engagement with Mr. Norton. He's almost painfully class conscious, but not as painfully race conscious. And this is something that is an important distinction with a difference that is about to hit him upside the head. Now, after that terrible journey in chapter 4, we get to chapter 5, and Invisible Man winds up in a chapel listening to a speech delivered in the tune of an old Baptist, or to the cadence of an old Baptist preacher, delivered by a fellow named Homer A. Barbie. Not to put too fine a point on it, but Homer, just like the Homer in Greek myth, Homer's going to tell you a tale. Homer's going to tell you a tale of an odyssey of the founder. He's going to lay the foundations of the institution that the Invisible Man is attending. And he's doing this in order to raise the spirits of the students there and to let them know what exactly it is that they are going there for. Barbie relates the founder's story, and the narrative of that story bridges the confusion the Invisible Man is feeling as a student following his experiences, his very, very class conscious experiences with Mr. Norton in a chauffeured vehicle. Now, the irony of all of this is that the founder who is being, I won't say lampooned, I wouldn't go that far with Ellison, but who is being narratively identified is indeed Booker T. Washington. And the institution that's being talked about by Homer Barbie is the Tuskegee Institute. And I will be honest, I didn't really realize that was what was happening until about halfway through Homer's speech. And I went, oh, that's what Ellison's doing here. He's talking about Tuskegee. And then and then it was like a little gap began to open in my understanding. And I began to see something that Dorollo and I talked about when we talked about W.E.B. Du Bois's Soul of the Black Folk. And we talked about, back in episode number 49, we discussed how there is a split in Black culture, and it exists even a year later, between the upper class Black intellectuals, folks who went to Pache, Dorollo Nixon, but folks who went to Cornell, folks who are going to Harvard currently. And we could talk a little bit about, if we want to more contemporize this, we could talk about Claudine Gay if we would like, but the Claudine Gay, Ibrahim X. Kendi, Ta-Nehisi Coates kind of folks who run the intellectual thought life, or think they do, of African Americans, Black people in this country. There's a split in that culture between those folks and the folks who, as I framed it last year on the podcast, and I will continue to frame it this year, the folks who actually do the chauffeuring and drive the buses, the folks who do the sharecropping, and the folks who have to go and work with people of all races at work and have to make nice. And by the way, make nice is probably a terrible term. It's not really making nice. It's called social negotiation. It's what we all have to do. There is a split in Black culture between those two perspectives. And Ellison understood that this split was evident. And by the way, it's going to become even more sharper when we get to chapter 6. Chapters 4, 5, and 6 are critical chapters in Invisible Man. And if you don't read any of the other parts of that book, I would encourage you to read those 3 chapters in a row, because they define very much what is happening right now in 2024, and what will probably be continuing into 2025 and 2026 in Black culture in America. Now, Homer Barbie is named after the writer, as I said before, of the Odyssey and the Iliad. And interestingly enough, not to give too much away, but he's blind. He's blind like the Cyclops in Greek myth. I don't think Ellison did that accidentally either. He can only remember Barbie, like the blinded patriarch of King Lear. He can only remember the story and provide soaring rhetoric, but he cannot provide genuine wisdom, which is what the Invisible Man, or Nameless, is looking for. With this speech, and this is the other thing that Ellison does that's genius, with this speech begins Nameless's descent into the Black Americanized version of Dante's Inferno, mashed up with Dostoevsky's Crime and Punishment, replete with a job that winds him up in a hellish manufacturing basement where he's monitoring valves underneath watchful eye of a union-busting, elderly African-American gentleman somewhere in New York City. Now, to put this in a historical context, Ellison...
It's on Long Island.
It's on Long Island?
Yep.
Okay, it's on Long Island. All right.
Yep.
Now, to put this in a historical context, Ellison at the time is writing this as a Marxist radical. He was a radicalized Marxist. And He later softened his rhetoric in a fashion similar to the writer Albert Murray, who we haven't read on the podcast, but we will. I'm fascinated by Albert Murray, and there's leadership lessons we can pull from Murray as well. And Ellison, of course, wound up disillusioned with ideological posing and posturing, and he wanted real change for Black people in America. But at the time of this writing, he was captured by Marxist ideals, because in 1933, when he went into Tuskegee, and on to the other side of 1952, when he finally published Invisible Man, Marxist socialism was considered to be the ideology that was doing the best for the most people on the face of the planet. Of course, at the time, due to the writing in the New York Times of Walter Duranty and many others, most people did not know that Stalin was purging, and there were gulags, and there was massive repression, and the ideology of the state, the totalizing ideology of the state, was locking up guys like Alexander Solzhenitsyn and torturing people and killing them, because in order to publish Pravda, you sometimes got to break a few eggs. By the way, just as a side note, I don't fault anybody in the early 20th century up until about 1945, 1950. I don't fault any people for having Marxist views in the first part of the 20th century. I really don't.
I do.
I don't, because they didn't really know. They didn't really know, and the truth wasn't
They
really
didn't
around.
know what? What didn't they know?
Here's what they didn't know. And by the way, thank you for challenging me on this, because people often push back on me on this. I don't hold people responsible because, number one, people didn't know the things about Lenin that we know now. They just didn't. Lenin was a great propagandist who managed to make his own image last quite strongly through a good chunk of the 20th century. That's number one. Number two, Marxism actually at that point, and people say this now, and people born after 1952, I fault them for saying this, but Marxism actually at that point was an ideology that had not wound up in its logical spot. It hadn't wound up in its clearing at the end of the path. It hadn't actually been fully tried. Now, anybody born after 1950, when they say, well, Marxism hasn't been fully tried, not even Marxism, sorry, communism hasn't been fully tried, I laugh at those people out of the room, because communism has been fully tried. Marxism has been fully tried, and it has been found wanting. By the way, it's the fully tried part of Marxism is where you wind up with gulags and concentration camps. That's the fully tried part. But at the time, pre-1952, we didn't in the West anyway, we didn't realize all of that. Then number three, the third reason why I don't hold anybody responsible for following Marxism or believing in the value of a Marxist worldview is because the people who had the courage to write about it, who were in opposition to that, were being actively repressed by intellectuals in the West. Because the intellectual class, just like with any other luxury belief that they have in the 21st century, wanted desperately for Marxism to work. And they were not willing to kill it in its cradle. They weren't willing to strangle it in its cradle. And then World War II came along, and everybody had to make sort of some decisions intellectually, morally, psychologically, spiritually. And look, say what you want, and we do say a lot, but I think World War II went the best it possibly could have gone. And I'll just leave it at that. Could have always been better, but it was the best out of a series of bad choices. So that's my reasoning. That's my reasoning.
I fault them because human nature and human experience provide enough of an education to know from the beginning that there's something fundamentally wrong with Marxism. It's why you can read the brilliant allegory of that brilliant, socialist yet realist George Orwell. You read Animal Farm, which I'm sure you've done in your podcast, but when you read Animal Farm, you get angry And as you're reading this allegory, you can feel the emotion building because you're reading about these acts of injustice and you're seeing the blindness of certain animals to what's going on and what's being done to them and what they're acquiescing in. And it's infuriating. And so, and of course, the very first time I read it in middle school, I was able, because of my love of history and my reading, I recognized what the parallels were to, so I could then begin to predict what was going to happen, because it tracks with, Bolshevik history. So, anyway, so why I fault them is that human nature and human experience tells them enough, tells the viewer of, or the consumer of, Marxist ideology that this is fundamentally unsound at best and evil at worst. And so but that's one of the reasons that it's a cop out from having to make harder choices. And we're human. We don't like making hard choices. Okay. In fact, that's part of human nature. Not to want to shirk making hard choices is part of human nature. And so, Marxism offers a compromise to a more just and fair society, but because it requires injustice to get there, therefore, fundamentally, axiomatically, it can't lead to a more just and fair society. That in order to get a more just and fair society, you have to somehow produce more just and fair people. And we only produce people one way. They all come from a woman who's an actual woman, and not anybody masquerading as a woman. Okay. And then you've got to raise these creatures, knowing that it is not only what you tell them, but what you show them that helps direct their paths, that helps expose them to how they ought to behave. And thus, it presupposes that we be more just and fair people, and thus produce more just and fair people to get to a more just and fair society. Nobody's got time for that. It takes multiple generations. And so we're all looking for shortcuts. And Marxism offers a shortcut. It also offers a scapegoat. It offers a way for the privileged to assuage their guilt. And if it happens to cost a few dozen or a few million lives, so be it. Now I can be at peace in my castle with my things, because this is what we've done out there. And now you can no longer tell me that you haven't been given this opportunity. You haven't been provided this good that you need. Not realizing that, of course, as soon as you turn on the envy machine, it doesn't go off. It doesn't need gasoline. It just keeps running. So eventually they're going to turn on you just because you're there with something they don't have. And to me, all of this, it's in there. It's in there.
Okay. So the question then becomes, the
DNA of it.
Okay. So then the question becomes, and by the way, I don't argue against all of that being in the DNA of Marxism. You're absolutely correct. My only assertion is that, and by the way, Orwell published Animal Farm in 1945. Okay. Just wanted to grab that date. I don't think it was fully or widely disseminated until the 1950s or so. And I do think the 1950s is a critical time in the middle 20th century when the tide begins to turn, in the West anyway, against Marxism, because of the things you stated now are fundamentally being realized. Because, again, Marxism up until the 1950s, and again, Marxism only had what, a 25-year-long lifespan, something like that, at least political Marxism. Cultural Marxism has a seemingly endless lifespan, but political Marxism had a 25-year, at least in the context of the Soviet Union versus the West, a 25-year-long lifespan of being tried. Now, anything that happens after 1950 happens because of exactly what you have stated, because now people become aware of this, and they become aware of the sharpness of this in the West, because the thing wound up at its logical conclusion. Just like short-circuiting the French Revolution didn't lead to less revolution. It just led to more of it, because the French revolutionary Jacobean sort of perspective was not fully allowed to play out. And this now becomes the question. So, for all of us born after 1950, which is the vast majority of folks who listen to this podcast, who know all of this, the question becomes, particularly for those of us who may have more melanin in our skin, why are we captured by the cultural version of Marxism? Because the cultural version of Marxism, and this drives me absolutely crazy, I have my own ideas on why, but why are we captured by the cultural version of Marxism? Because it's going to produce, it's the same envy machine, just turned on in culture. And it's going to wind up in the same place. And we know what the clearing at the end of the path is. We can no longer claim that we are disillusioned. We can no longer claim that we do not know. We can no longer claim that Marxism has not been fully tried. It has been fully tried. We know where it ends up. Dorollo just said it. Dorollo, why are Black intellectuals captured by cultural Marxism? Why? Why was Ellison captured by cultural Marxism?
I have an answer.
Okay.
Bear with me a sec.
Sure.
I think that, and not just, even, dare we say it, the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., right?
Mm-hmm.
I think when you reach a point in the struggle for more equality and justice in America, I think when you reach a point of recognition that despite your best efforts, the mass of society is not changing fast enough, perhaps, but just not changing. Disillusionment can set in when one has assumed that through one's efforts, a more just and fair society on a wide scale can be produced quickly. And so then one looks for the shortcut. And that's, to me, that when one has the best motives, that, in my opinion, is what happens. When someone, in contrast, is disposed to hating the society, hating this magnificent scheme of constitutional rights that's supposed to work in a colorblind fashion, that was set up to work in a colorblind fashion, and was it hijacked by white power freaks? Yes, but it was supposed to function in a way that it didn't matter what you looked like. These are the rights you had as a man. These are the rights you had as a woman. These institutions are supposed to enforce them. Great. Now go live your lives. It was wonderful. But anyway, there are people who are disposed to hate that system anyway. And so for them, I think jumping on the bandwagon of a political movement whose stated goal is to overturn that system just is a more natural choice, and one more easily made. But it's the idealists who then are disillusioned, like Nameless, right? Nameless is disillusioned several times in this work, and they're beautiful moments where there's even foreshadowing, again, like I approach reading this as someone who I have a degree in English literature. So I concentrated in the modern novel. I know how to approach this, and this is extremely well written. But just, beautiful moments of foreshadowing, like when Brother Jack tells Nameless, "You are right not to trust me." That's what he says in the beginning. And it's right there. And it's just like, and I circled it then because I realized, not knowing what's coming, I said to myself, oh, this is wise insight. You're absolutely right. Whoever you are, whatever you're going to do, that is true. And so later on, it's like, hey, wait, he told you. He told you. And you, naive young man, now you're getting it. And it's a shame because, I just saw it. Literally another insight just came. I was about to say it's a shame that, it actually didn't cost his invisibility in which he finds himself at the end didn't cost him his eyes. Thinking of Oedipus and thinking of Samson. And then it's like, wait a minute, but it did. Like, ding! And it's just like, oh, but I just saw that. I literally just saw, no pun intended, I just saw that. And it's just like, yep. It just, this is excellent. Like, this needs to be taught. Shoot, so, you could spend a quarter of a year on this book and it would be worth it in a high school literature class. It's like, what are you going to do this year? We're going to do 4 books, 1 per marking period, and we're going to spend real time in them. We're going to read them more than once, and you're going to understand when we're done, this is what a great American novel is like, such that when you're then trying to find the next one or write the next one, you'll know how to construct, you know, a beautiful masterpiece, you know, because this is what it is. It's literally phenomenal. And you see the young man on his journey. Oh, you mean you see the Odyssey? Yes, you see the Odyssey. Oh, so maybe we should teach those old, gray, dust-covered. Yes, we should, absolutely. In fact, and you should probably read at least 2 versions, because what the heck is her last name? Professor Emily Wilson her Iliad just came out, her translation of it, and the Odyssey came out, I think, like 5-6 years ago. And so I would reading her versions, I think, makes sense, and then reading at least one other, I think, makes sense. But I think what she's doing with classics is amazing, which is, of course, why I'm talking about her right now. So,
of course, yeah. Okay, so Homer Barbie. I want to wind back to here, because around that cultural Marxism, there is a tension, and we're going to explore this in sort of the next section here. We're going to talk about the molding of the white underclass by Dr. Bledsoe. The dynamic that is on the other side of this is the dynamic that Homer represents. Now, Homer is blind, yes. Homer Barbie can only deliver soaring rhetoric, but not wisdom, yes. But Homer Barbie represents the founder, the Booker T. Washington, the institution of Tuskegee, an institution that Ellison himself found to be, as was mentioned earlier, class conscious. And you get this sense reading chapters 4, 5, and 6 of Invisible Man, that Ellison could not resolve this tension. He could merely expose it, which is, I think, is something else that great literature does. It exposes the tension, but it does not necessarily seek to resolve it all the time. And the tension that exists is between institutions that are class consciousness and class conscious, and dare I say, bourgeois, to use a Marxist framing, versus institutions that are not class conscious, or at least claim to not be class conscious, and claim to be culturally free or morally free, and lay a claim to the Marxist definition of freedom, where everyone has everything shared equally. Okay. Homer represents that institution, and Ellison has Homer being blind. And by the way, Nameless doesn't realize that Homer is blind until Homer stumbles, which also is interesting. Stumbles while going to sit, after delivering his speech, stumbles while going back to sit down next to Dr. Bledsoe. We talked about this last year with Booker T. Washington versus W.E.B. Du Bois. We kind of have delved into a little bit here. But to me, this is the representative tension in Black American culture. This is the representative tension. It's between the Booker T. Washington folks and the W.E.B. Du Bois folks. It's no more complicated than that. And the Booker T. Washington folks, the Black middle class, seek to raise up. Number one, they are embarrassed by the Black lower class, which was represented in Invisible Man by the incest-driven sharecropper. So there's an embarrassment there. There's a realization that the only way to bring yourself up to sort of be on parallel with the white man, such as it were, is through education. And by the way, I always mention this every single time we do these podcasts, but I went to a state school. I didn't go to Cornell, but I read a lot of books. Dorollo went to Cornell. Comparatively, in Black American culture in the early 21st century, we are considered to be privileged by other Black people who also went to the same institutions that we went to, which is ironic and interesting. And we, of course, are tagged as Black men in America with this invisible duty. And I'm going to write about this in my upcoming book. I'm writing a series of cultural commentary essays, which this is the first public announcement of that. And so they are going to be coming out later on this year. But I'm writing a particular essay about this tension between what I quote unquote owe the race versus just because there should be some sense of racial solidarity because I happen to share melanin with you versus what I don't owe a society where the majority may not share my melanin with me. There's a tension there. And I have always, this is why, part of the reason why I've run back to Hemingway, I've always rejected that tension because I think that's a false dichotomy. And I think it's pretend. And I think that it allows cynical race hustling to exist, which Dr. Bledsoe represents the cynical part of that. And we're going to visit him in just a second. But the disillusioned part, the part that seeks to keep individuals like Nameless in naivete, is represented by the Baptist ramblings of Homer Barbee. And if you go and read Homer Barbee's recitation of what the founder did, there's actually nothing there. Now, that's Ellison's critique of Booker T. Washington. But again, it's a critique from the political, if we're going to go there, political left. It's not a critique from the political right. A critique from the political right would have had Homer speaking in actual practical terms of how many people that institution actually raised up out of the dust of sharecropping and put them on a road to being middle class. An actual recitation of the actual story of the founder would have involved not how the founder fooled white people into giving him money to start the school and had a statue built of him. It wouldn't have included that, or how the founder pretended to be subservient and yet had victory over Whitey. It wouldn't have included any of that, which, by the way, the speech did include that. It would have instead, as a critique from the right, would have included how many people of a particular melanin were led to a greater conception of liberty through the use of their own skills and ability, regardless of whether or not the society was racially opposed to them. It would have been a story of victory from the right. It would have been a critique of the potential of that person from the right. And this is why there's only one Dr. Martin Luther King, but why there are many, many, many progeny after Malcolm X. Many, many, many. Okay. My main pushback on Ellison in this chapter, my main pushback on Homer Barbee, is that it sets up the manipulation of Nameless as a person with no agency. And so it's not, it's the logical conclusion of that is, of course, you will become invisible. You have no agency. Now, your eyes, to your point, will not become invisible. You'll still be able to see, but you'll have no agency. And I think that was Ellison's frustration, was that these tensions don't lead to a greater, either tensions from the left or tensions from the right, don't lead to a greater understanding or a greater agency of the individual. And by the way, Ellison, Podhertz makes this point in his critique of Ellison. Every time he ran into Ellison always spoke from the position of Black people being individuals. That was Ellison's main critique against Baldwin. Baldwin wanted to put everybody in a group. He's like, get the hell out of town. We're actually individuals. Who are you to put me in a group? I don't know you. Just because we happen to share the same skin tone doesn't mean I share anything else with you. And by the way, I'm going to double down and bring it up to the front of 2024. Just because I happen to share the same melanin as a a Lowry or a John McWhorter or a Tahi Nahasi Coates or a Nicole Hannah Jones, she of the 1619 Project, does not mean they speak for me. Doesn't mean that they know the solution to the problem. We just happen to be the same skin tone. That's an accident of genetics.
Well, here's some pushback.
Go ahead, pushback. Yeah, pushback.
Yeah. No, I wasn't asking. I'm saying here is some pushback.
Yeah, pushback. Yeah.
So one of the values of this novel, and it's a strange thing to say, but one of the values of this novel is how it serves as a cultural artifact. Because in his time, there was still a lot of internal unity within broadly African Americans as a social group. Okay. And there were certain powerful dynamics that played out, and certain shared cultural traits, shared cultural experiences that created an instantaneous feeling of, dare we say it, brotherhood. Even at a remove of 800 miles or 1,000 miles, however far it is from the middle of Alabama to Manhattan.
Right.
And he did a good job of showing that. For example, how many, we're talking, he is Ellison, and Nameless is who I'm now talking about. Nameless meets in the book, or met in the book, many individuals who knew as soon as he started talking, oh, you're from the South.
Right.
Yep. Or saw how he dressed or whatever it was, and started immediately talking to him as Northerners would talk to Southerners, meaning,
by the way,
I want to drop and unsophisticated, you know.
I want to drop in another name just to sort of help you with where you're going with this pushback. Thomas Sowell came from this time.
Right.
Okay. So Thomas Sowell fundamentally looks at everything that happens in the post-civil rights era and goes, what the hell? Because I mean, he's a much more polite man who's much more with much more erudition than myself, but he goes, what the hell?
But okay, so I'm going to get back to my point. You have this great internal cultural unity. He does a great job of showing that within the Southern context, regardless of social class, right? And thus, Nameless is in his milieu that is not really Edenic, okay? Part of my notes that I have on reading this, which of course is what you do when you're studying a novel, I have questions. And the very first question I wrote was, why are the campus fountains broken? Everything is perfect, but the campus fountains are broken. So what does freely flowing, controlled water represent? Where is that? Where do we see rivers? Where do we see, that which gives life? Okay. And so my interpretation of why the fountains are broken is because this is a little artifact and they're just keeping it going. And you'll notice Nameless's original ambition was to stay in that pseudo Eden forever, to become like Dr. Bledsoe, to stay there and then teach there. And so it's like, well, what is he actually doing? Nothing. He's literally running on a treadmill. He got introduced to a treadmill and then he's running on a treadmill. And the problem he has is that he fell off the treadmill. But the point of, the problem is not the problem he had. The first event that happened to him that got him on the road to actual clarity at some point was that he fell off the treadmill, right? He fell out of this Eden. But the point I was trying to raise is that whether he's talking to True Blood, the sharecropper with his significant family issues, living in slave cabins, okay, or it doesn't matter who it was in the Golden Day. The bartender knew who he was. People knew where he came from. There was this tremendous internal cultural unity. Now, you shift up north, and one of the critiques I have of the writing of this part is that Nameless wouldn't have known or shouldn't have known what a West Indian sounded like. And so there was an introduction to, this person sounds funny. I can't figure out where they're from. Right. Because in New York, you would have had West Indians. West Indians, like the parents of General Colin Powell.
Mm-hmm.
Right. In New York, very normal. Not in the middle of Alabama, not even close. And so how the way in which the author identified that the person was a West Indian, I didn't like that, because there should have been something that forced Nameless to learn this Black person is not a Black person like us. This Black person is from this island over here, but is now in our midst and sharing in this struggle and suffering some of the same abuses and perfectly willing to use violence on Irish American policemen because they happened to be evicting a woman in the middle of winter, the policeman wasn't, he was just there. It was the two other guys evicting the woman. But anyway, so against that background, I understand how someone whom I don't know can see me. We share melanin and we may share some experience, etc., and we can establish a rapport very easily. For me, I started in the position you were in, and I literally, this is what I articulate to my father. Like, I don't know these people. Like, why am I saying I don't know who these people are? I don't know who these people are. They don't know me. They don't know my middle name. That's a joke. If you know me, you'll get it. They don't know my middle name. They don't know the first thing about Dorollo Nixon Jr. What do I share in common with them? And then you could fast forward in a very few amount of years. I was probably 12. You could fast forward to when I was 20, abroad, a French speaker, and then I'd see Black people, and of course we'd nod and say hello. It's totally, by that point, it was totally, that point I got it. So it was totally normal to me. And I remember foreign white friends of mine being baffled by that experience and be like, do you know him? And it's like, no, I don't know him. But they just couldn't grasp how both he and I could just, there we go. They couldn't get it. Fine.
So the seduction of a racially no. Let me push back on this idea of Eden. Ellison brings Nameless out of Eden because you eventually have to get kicked out of the garden. That's just how it works. Right. And we as Christians can argue about, or can talk about, the nature of sin and evil and choices and separating light from dark and all of that. Ellison doesn't get into any of that. It would have been interesting if he did, but he wasn't going in that direction, and that wasn't what he was writing. He was doing something that every great adventure novel does, which Invisible Man is a great adventure novel. You push the hero out into the world so that the hero kills snakes or fights dragons. The dragons of 1940s and 1950s American society were, of course, Jim Crow, and particularly for a Black American during those times, that was the biggest dragon. That was the biggest thing to slay. And so pushing.
Well, it wasn't the South, right? It wasn't.
Right.
It wasn't the issue in the North. In the North, I would say.
Well, everybody says that, but the knock-on effects from Jim Crow were in the North. There's no geographic distancing of this, and
but I think there is. I think there is. I think there is. I think Ellison got that point and thus put it into his novel. There were ways in which Norton was out of place in the middle of Alabama, knew he was out of place, but was committed to what they were doing. And he was thus contrasted easily to those men in the first scenes in the novel, that random freaking blind prize fight, right? Where at the end, well, here's your, here's your little token we give you. Oh, by the way, we're actually going to give you this. Oh, and yes, sure. You're all bloodied and you can speak to us.
Yeah.
Yay. Those men, that was a different milieu. Okay.
And I don't want to talk about
men like that in the North Shore. Not a doubt in my mind. But the way the society approached the issues and the history of the way the limiting of opportunities for Black people took place in a place like New York. They're differences that, in my opinion, matter.
I don't think
I
they
think
matter for the narrow thing we're talking. I mean, I do think they matter for the overall novel for sure, but for the narrow thing I'm trying to get to here, they don't matter. And the narrow thing that I'm trying to get to here is, I think that the reason a novel like this doesn't get talked about nearly as much as it should be talked about in Black culture, particularly now, is because of two things that have happened simultaneously that have impacted all of American culture, but most notably have impacted Black culture.
Okay. What are those two things?
So the two things that have happened are atomization due to the internet and social media. That has impacted overall American culture ridiculously, and it has impacted Black culture quite notoriously. And then the second thing that has happened is, and we've already talked about this, is the prevalence of the power of intellectual cultural Marxism being gussied up and sold as institutional as battles against institutionalized white racism. And from there, I go directly to Claudine Gay's problems. I don't know Claudine Gay. Now, just so we can give some background to folks who may not know, I'm going to give a little background here. Claudine Gay was the president of Harvard for about 5 minutes. She is most notorious for being in the public eye as a person who went to Congress, could not robustly, how could I say this, repudiate anti-Semitism in the Harvard culture over which she presides, was then hoisted by her own petard by a substacker named Christopher Rufo, who went to Harvard Extension, not Harvard, and discovered that she had plagiarized, and the level to which she had plagiarized we can argue about, but had discovered that she had plagiarized, and by the way, on the ground had a thin, actually, shall I say, non-existent CV of publication. That was strike 1 and 2. Strike 3 was that the Harvard hedge fund managers who actually run the money of that institution decided that they were going to get up on their high horse and run her out of town. And they did. They ran her out of the Harvard presidency. And so she has been demoted, not from the Harvard institution as a whole, just been demoted from Harvard president, and gets to hold on to her faculty position to the tune of $900,000 a year in salary with benefits. By the way, Ms. Gay comes from a Ivy League background, which is the only way you get to be even considered from that kind of role. And her background is, to the point about Dorollo just made about being about West Indians, she's Haitian. That's some background on Claudine Gay. So to go back to what I was saying, those two factors, the atomization that has been provided by the internet and social media, that breaking apart of people from the solidarity of groups and internal solidarity that you were talking about, that Eden of internal cohesion, is now being busted apart everywhere. We are all being turned into atomized individual units. I read something the other day where it made the analogy to some things that are happening in our culture of 1 million ants all being on the march. 1 million ants have finally turned in a collective direction. And it's really hard for a mass to stop 1 million ants. It's really hard. My point is, this has happened in Black culture. That's the one step. And then the two step is that cultural Marxism that has infected our intellectual elites. Our intellectual elites have not been infected by the pull you up by your bootstraps, no matter ideas of a Booker T. Washington. Those have been abandoned. And I don't think either one of those factors allows for a modern Black person. You talk about this book being a cultural artifact, allows for a modern Black person to even understand what Ellison is talking about. I think if I put this book in front of, let's say, you talked about reading it in high school. I think if I put this in front of 10th graders in a Chicago high school, they wouldn't be able to read it, but they know how to do TikTok. They wouldn't be able to read it, much less comprehend it.
That's a fundamental educational problem, yes. It's possible that a good number of them would not be. I agree 100%.
Okay.
I don't think so. I think what is more of a driver of the atomization are two cultural effects that precede one of your points. Okay.
Go ahead.
Namely, I think the two effects are the overwhelming success of the civil rights movement in the 60s and the suburbanization of America. And because of those factors, we can have an atomization. Well, one, we're spread across the country in ways we weren't before. Two, we can have an atomization that leaves us marooned as individuals in these isolated islands of loneliness or whatever. But that wouldn't be possible if we were all shoved in urban ghettos or in this mass called the South with its dominating culture and institutional racism. I don't think it could be possible without the civil rights movement being, very successful and the suburbanization of American culture, and so now power centers, etc., they're not urban based the same way they were before. Culture happened. American culture and the seat of American culture became a couch. Okay. It used to be a seat in a theater. Okay. Or a seat in some kind of performance hall in a large city. It shifted to being a freaking couch or a seat in a movie theater that is still in a suburb. That's what happened. Okay. Everybody moved to Long Island, keeping the trope alive. Well, it's not a trope he used, but because the factory was found on Long Island and this guy and Nameless was living in New York City, I'm going to keep the trope that way. So, and it's a trope that my family went through. So there you go. Meaning my father's mother took him and two of his siblings, the two alive at the time, and moved them from rural, segregated East Carolina, where the family had lived literally for hundreds of years, to New York and then quickly to Long Island. So everybody moved to Long Island, and now this suburbanization, could begin. And so the culture shift, the cultural seat shifted, the throne, as it were, of our cult, they shifted. They were then found in different places. And so arguably, that's actually far more efficient of a model than the one before in terms of, no, not efficient. It's evidence of scale. Okay. That when it went from urban to suburban, it scaled. Okay, that's an example of scale. In an urban setting, you gotta be there, get in the halls, you gotta travel there, be able to survive there. It's more expensive there, blah blah blah. When it reached the couch phase, okay, this is affordable, mass market, all of those trends coming out of the post World War II 50s big corporate era, right? And so here they are playing out in culture in many ways.
All right, well, back to the book. This is a good spot to go back to the book. Back to Invisible Man by Ralph Ellison. So again, the three most important chapters probably in the first part of this book are chapter 4, 5, and 6. And so we turn to a summary of chapter 6. Following Homer A. Barbie's rousing speech that re-deifies the founder, the Invisible Man, or Nameless, is still confused. He's still in the space of naivete. He's not yet been kicked out of Eden quite just yet, but it's coming. And it's coming in the form of a gentleman named Dr. Bledsoe. So chapter 6 opens up with the Invisible Man being full of hope from Barbie's speech, but also full of trepidation because he doesn't want to leave Eden. He doesn't want to leave his comfortable spot and go someplace else. And he does not know what will happen when he goes and talks to the estimable Dr. Bledsoe. First thing he does is he goes and checks to see if Mr. Norton is okay. The white man he was chauffeuring around town, who unfortunately wound up in unfortunate circumstances. And then he goes to see the head of the school. Like I said, the aforementioned Dr. Bledsoe. The Dr. Bledsoe character is a attempt by Ellison to preserve the institutional value of, to Dorollo's point, Eden. And Bledsoe lays out very cynically for the Invisible Man exactly what he's doing in Alabama. And what he's doing is he's manipulating white people to get them to give him money for the most cynical of reasons and the most cynical of outcomes. And that everything that the Invisible Man did with Mr. Norton, who is a white trustee in the book, everything that he did threatened everything that Dr. Bledsoe had. Dr. Bledsoe was set up as a character that is sitting on top of a hierarchy, is ruling that hierarchy, and is not looking to be replaced nor be removed. Even how he is described as being fat, as being full of not jolliness, but full of sort of cynical cheer. All of these are symbols, literary symbols, that Ellison is using to move the reader towards this idea that Bledsoe is an early prototype of individuals that would come later in the civil rights movement. And he is an early prototype of those individuals. He's an early version of Jesse Jackson, or a chubbier version of Al Sharpton. Dr. Bledsoe says to the Invisible Man that basically he's manipulating these white people. Everything that the Invisible Man did with Mr. Norton threatens his manipulation, and that he has to leave the institution. But he will be allowed to return if he just takes 7 letters of introduction. And so he takes those 7 letters, because the Invisible Man is still naive at the time. Nameless is still naive. Takes those 7 letters, gets on a bus, which ironically enough has a former veterinarian on it who helped him out with Mr. Norton, and takes his bus out of Eden to go to Harlem. The most interesting thing for me about chapter 6 is that Dr. Bledsoe's efforts keep the narrator away from his school, and they are reflective of a multiplicity of various psychosocial dynamics within the Black community in America for at least the last 100 years. I see Dr. Bledsoe's everywhere, everywhere in the Black community. They're like whack-a-mole. And the fundamental point, I think, to remember about Ellison's book is that it is not primarily about the racism of white people. That's just background fodder. That's table stakes, such as it were. That was the thing he expected everybody to know, because this is, as Dorollo already said, a cultural artifact of its time. He expected everybody in 1952 to know that this is what he's writing about. So he wasn't really writing about that because he didn't need to say it out loud. Instead, he is writing, I think Ellison's book is primarily about Black people being kept down by other Black people, and about the cynical grifting of white people by Black people who claimed to possess loftier goals. By the way, we see this cynical grifting even in our own era, from Barack Obama and the Black Lives Matter movement, all the way to the race hustling. I already mentioned Al Sharpton and Jesse Jackson, all the way to the cultural cachet, or the former cultural cachet, of folks like Oprah and Bill Cosby. By the way, I was never a fan of Oprah, and Eddie Murphy got a call allegedly from Bill Cosby back in the day to tell him not to be so dirty. And Richard Pryor, when Eddie Murphy told Richard Pryor what Bill Cosby said, Richard Pryor allegedly said, "Tell Bill to have another pudding pop. or maybe have another Coke and shut up. The Invisible Man's invisibility didn't start with his relations with the dominant culture. It started with his relations with his own culture.
Very good point. Yes.
Ellison was a Marxist, but Ellison was also a humanist.
Mm-hmm.
He wanted Black people to stand up as individuals on their own 2 feet, I think.
Mm-hmm.
And he also didn't think, I don't believe, that grifting the whites was going to get Black people much of anywhere.
The fountains are all broken.
Yeah. And they remain broken, by the way. There is no Eden to go back to.
Correct. Now there no longer is. And I think that's good personally, because that means that Jim Crow is done. That means that that whole milieu that created this strange insulated state of things is done. But as somebody who, loves, I mean, I've lived abroad more than once. I speak more than one language. I love people and love different types of people. And so I cheer that American society is far more complex, and it's no longer, biracial, monolingual, monocultural, and that that's part of the normal way of doing things in America. There are, as there are Black leaders who decry the end of segregation, because the end of segregation over time, and I don't think it's cause and effect. It's just it correlates, but over time, the decrease in Black lawyers, Black architects, Black engineers, Black doctors, the Black professionals owning and running their own firms, the numbers have collapsed basically. And so there are Black leaders who decry the end of that era, because you had those great institutions within our race here. I'm not somebody who shares that position for the reasons I already gave. And so, I agree with you that what Ellison most likely wanted to see, we see in the struggles of Nameless, okay, to get the people in Harlem to actually then respond, and he can get them to a certain point, and then outside forces keep pulling him back down, keep pulling him away. We're going to send you down here so you can be distracted. Oh, dude. But that line, there's a line when he meets that woman, and I just laughed my head off. It's about the class struggle and the ass struggle.
Oh, yeah.
It's absolutely the funniest line in the whole book. Oh, man. And there's some beautiful lines in this book. That wasn't a beautiful line. It was just a hilarious line. But it's just, that was classic. That was well put and well located. And it just sounds like exactly what would happen, But yeah, so the people in Harlem never rose up. They never rose up as individuals. They never rose up as an organized unit to be able to say, this is what we want, and here's what we're going to do until we get it. And by the way, here's how we're building. Here's how we're trying to construct, using the skills we have, a better tomorrow for ourselves and our children. On a scale where it was, Harlem's a neighborhood, right? Or it's a neighborhood and a community within Manhattan, within northern Manhattan. But anyway, point being, as a unit, that's not what happened. There was always something. And that's, Nameless came to that, realization that, he could have these great concentrated moments of breakthrough, like his first protest. Well, not his first protest, when he first spoke in Harlem, at an eviction that was happening in the winter. And then it morphed into a protest briefly, and then morphed into a riot. And he literally had to flee, but that he could have successes like that, because arguably there was some success in that. Obviously not the latter bits, but you see the point. But it didn't translate into a community-wide organized movement for a better tomorrow. And of course, because this novel is so well constructed, there's both an internal dynamic that sabotaged it, right? And an external dynamic that betrayed it. Now, one of the pieces I find interesting You know, well, it's one of your questions, right? What are the
Hmm.
processes used to keep people in their place among Black Americans? And
Hmm.
they exist. They're there. And you don't even have to be in high school before you experience them. You know, they exist in middle school. These pressures, these fears that are, you know, sometimes lobbed, sometimes just slide across the table. Other times it's right in your face and someone's screaming at you. But just, you know, the notion that, hey, we're this massive labor union, you've got to get in line, take your number, show up, and vote accordingly. And of course, men like you and I hate that. And will never do that. And so it's just, you know, but they're out there, you know. So more specifically, you know, the the employing fear of loss of economic opportunity, fear of physical violence by nameless,
Hmm.
ubiquitous white racists, you know,
Hmm.
um, rather than fear of violence from actually can be found in Black neighborhood, Black thugs. You know, that one's not deployed as much, but they're
Hmm.
there. And in this novel, of course, they are deployed and they are there,
Hmm.
which is again well done on his part, very well done. Um, they know it's funny. I don't know why it took me this long into the podcast to mention I used to live in Harlem. So it's interesting because he's talking about places I've been.
Right.
Um, and I can relate to some of what he's talking about from, you know, having lived there, even down to the when they moved him to what was probably um it's the upper part of the Upper East Side, but there's streets where before it gets to Spanish Harlem where it's a little bit
Hmm.
mixed. And so I lived in Spanish Harlem when I lived in Harlem. So it's just like I could relate to when the authors talk about this mixed Spanish Irish neighborhood. I underlined them like, oh,
Hmm.
okay. Yeah, I can relate to this. There's also a little Italian in the corner I was in. But anyway, I digress. Um it's a lot of fear and social pressure. It's not as much economic, but there's a whole lot of use of signals, right? The things that signal something else, like political party affiliation signals something to the people who then are going to start engaging and using these processes to try to get you to move somewhere else, you know, in terms of your behavior, if not your thought, because they don't really care about what you think. It's are you going to do what I'm telling you to do?
Right. Are
Just
you, are
like,
you,
you know, the power structure of this brotherhood in this book, you know, like I
right.
don't care what you think. Let us do the strategizing, you know, not let us. We do the strategizing. You do what you're told. Oh, okay. Okay. You sound like an organization that I want to be part of. Like I have zero interest in that. And it just took Nameless hundreds of pages to get to a point where he might be willing to challenge that in any real way. And of course, pun intended, and I won't say exactly why so it doesn't ruin it, but pun intended, it was eye opening. So it's
It
like, okay,
was.
there you go.
Yeah.
Yeah. So,
There it is. Yeah. Okay.
mm-hmm.
So the thing that we are approaching, I think, in the 21st century, we have to wrap up our podcast and episode today. And I'd like to thank Dorollo for coming on and talking about this great book,
Sure.
and exploring the vagaries and the intricacies of this as we again use this episode as our kickoff to this year's Black History Month. And we'll have Dorollo on a little bit later on this month, talking about James Baldwin, and notes from a native son, Baldwin, who was the antithesis of Ellison. Um, I think we're approaching a space in our culture now, and I think that the intellectual uh, cavalcade of folks that I've mentioned on this podcast in the Black community, and by the way, this is part of the reason why there's no Black leader anymore, but the intellectual cavalcade of folks that I've mentioned on this podcast um, are flopping around, particularly in a post 2020 context, are flopping around waiting for the next crisis or the next riot to pop up where they can coalesce people around.
Mm-hmm.
And the reason why this is happening is because the atomization that has negatively impacted Black Americans has also had positive impacts. And the positive impact of atomization is this: when I move to the suburbs, I get to be my own man.
Mm-hmm.
I get to be my own man when I move to Harlem.
Mm-hmm.
I get to be me as Hassan or me as Dorollo. Racial reconciliation comes from individuals relating to and intermarrying with individuals. That's where it comes from. It doesn't come from the Edenic sort of ideal of we will all be in solidarity with each other and push a culture towards something. That happens only once, and it happened in the middle of the 20th century, and now we're done. We're never going to go back to that. As NWA infamously said back in the day, or it might not have been NWA, it might have been Dr. Dre. I can't remember. But one of the rappers back in the 90s said, Malcolm and Martin are gone, and I got to live out here. Yeah.
Yep. It sounds like a West Coast statement. It does.
Malcolm,
it does not sound like somebody in Harlem. It sounds like somebody in Los Angeles.
Yes. Well, Malcolm and Martin are gone. And what are we going to do? Right. And Malcolm and Martin weren't going to come down to the ghetto and come get me. They don't know me, and I don't know them. And I got to live out here with these people. There's a lot of truth in that. And Snoop Dogg now hangs around with Martha Stewart.
I think it's awesome.
Which I think is incredible.
I really get a huge kick out of that. That they're like BFFs. I get a kick out of that.
It is ridiculous.
What's his name? His real name is Calvin, right?
Calvin Brodus Jr.
Yes. Junior. Yep. Deuces.
At what point do you think, and by the way, there are now pressures being put on the African American, the Black community in America by Hispanics and by Asians, massive pressures. And I guess I'd like to wrap up this podcast today with maybe this question. If you're a leader who happens by genetic accident to be Black in an organization, and you are leading a multi-ethnic, multiracial organization, and this month comes upon you when you are asked by virtue of silence to comment on it, because the silence always becomes deafening right around this month if you happen to be Black in an organization and you happen to be in leadership. What do you say after reading Invisible Man? What do you say to your people about this month?
Well, it's interesting because the first point of departure I have is I follow the premise of the question. I don't think it extends to, well, when the firm is actually owned and run by Black people, because then it might be different. You could have Black History 12 months of the year. Or you could have it none. It depends. Or you could have it still in February. It depends on the culture and the values of the leaders and the owners of the entity, versus a leader within an entity that is really just a typical American, normal mainline American culture creation. And thus one can pretty reasonably anticipate that it wasn't founded and run by Black people. Anyway, the position, the perspective might be different. And so for me, who owns and runs a multi-ethnic organization, what I focus on coming out of this is, I push the novel. That's a no-brainer. Like, read the novel, it's awesome. But what got to me, because it's one of his themes, right? And again, I have notes because as a guy with a degree in English lit, like, right, how to approach this. This is how you study a novel. Anyway, one of the themes is that everyone wants to use you for some purpose of their own. And so for people I lead, I want to make sure. And the last time I onboarded someone was literally last week. And so it's like, I told her, I told her, one of the things that we will go through are your goals for your career. And immediately that is said, there's some tension. I'm telling someone who works for me, I'm going to help you achieve your goals. We're going to work on your career goals. That may mean that I help her get out of the seat she's in and go work for somebody else, whether herself or somebody else. I may end up helping her do that. Why am I willing to do that? Because the type of values that we read about in this novel, by the power structures represented by the Dr. Bledsoe and the brother Jacks are anathema to me. I hate them. I want them burnt down. And so I don't want to run an institution where I'm effectively co-opting people's best years and efforts for my good over their good, for my benefit over their benefit. I don't ever want to do that. And so, therefore, my whole leadership model is about, okay, I am trying to help you get to where you're trying to go. And together, what we're trying to do is achieve the goals that I have set out in line with my values. And as long as that's shared, it works. And when it's not shared, then not only is the person probably in the wrong seat, they're probably going to want to depart. And so that can work. You know, one of the best people I had working for me told me in the beginning exactly how long she was going to work for me, and she kept it just about to a T. Okay. And there was an external reason in part why, but there were also internal reasons. But she was able to tell me in the beginning, this is how long I'm going to work for you. And that was it. It played out. It's great. It helped her meet her goals. It also helped me meet my goals. Now, she's a very strong leader, and so she knew to do things like that. Okay, great. So back to me. Okay, so how do I help my people achieve their goals? And my people, I'm talking about the people working for my firm. I'm not talking about my people in a King X, etc. way. But how do I help my people achieve their individual goals? You know, because if I lead them and help them in that process, they're going to do great. They're going to do exceedingly well helping me achieve my goals. And if I don't do that, they still may do well. You know, they even may do exceedingly well, but there's a cost. You know, there's a cost in terms of trust. There's a cost in terms of like an actual physical cost on their bodies over time, on their minds. You know, like the hourglass, those sands are going. And so it's just like, you know, at the end of the day, if they've worked for me and they've been compensated fairly and hopefully well, but certainly fairly, and, you know, we've been able to achieve some good and help other people, that's great. And if they can walk away from that and they were treated well, I'm good. You know, I'm good. I'd rather have that than I managed to cobble together some motley crew, and I cajoled, threatened, bribed, and assaulted them so that they'd work for me for like 30 years. And then I bounced on, you know, I'm retiring, I'm out. And then it just collapsed. And then they have no retirement, no pension. They don't know what's going, like, that's not a success. Okay, that's a tragedy. But the real tragedy is that they didn't see it, that they couldn't perceive what was being done to them. And this novel shows at least one unnamed man's journey to realizing what the heck was going on with him. Just one little brief point. I don't understand why he didn't say there's 7 letters. I'm going to assume the contents are the same. I'm going to sacrifice one and open it up, and then I'll have the other 6. If he had just done that, maybe he would have got back on a bus with an axe. Hi, Dr. Bledsoe. Bam! You know, and then there would have been no novel, right? But there would have been, on some level, some measure of justice I think we could live with. And would it have cost him his life in Alabama in 1951? You know it. They'd have lit him up. Lit him up like a funeral pyre. Man. But yeah, great work, great book. Happy to be here. Thank you.
And with that, I'd like to thank once again Dorollo Nixon Jr. for coming on our podcast today. And we're out. Thank you for listening and subscribing to the Leadership Lessons from the Great Books podcast. If you're listening to this on any of the major podcast players, like iTunes, Google Podcasts, or Spotify, please go ahead and leave us a 5-star review and write a little bit in there. A couple of sentences is good enough. That actually helps us game those algorithms that I was just maybe addressing. And, of course, it helps us grow the show. Tell all your family, tell all your friends, and tell the leaders in your life that you know that need to be listening to this show that this show exists. By the way, if you want to get started on the leadership path yourself, or you know some people who need to go on the leadership path, HSCT Publishing, the home company of Leadership Toolbox and Leadership Lessons from the Great Books podcast, can help you and your team do that. So check out our training webinars, coaching services, and more at leadershiptoolbox.us. We are remote, we're live, we're in person, we're on video, and we've got leadership development solutions for your civic group, nonprofit staff, public sector staff, or even your private sector leaders. And of course, you're going to want to check out our video-based subscription service at leadingkeys.com. That's leadingkeys.com for leadership development on demand. You don't like videos, you don't like training, but you really like the podcast? Well, I would also recommend reading a book. Matter of fact, I'd recommend reading my most recent book, 12 Rules for Leaders, The Foundation of Intentional Leadership. You can get that in paperback, hardcover, or as an ebook on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, Kobo, Ingram Spark, and any other place that you order books online. Finally, of course, we're on YouTube just like everybody else is. We'd love to have you help us grow the YouTube channel, so like and subscribe to the video version of this podcast on the HSCT Publishing channel on YouTube. Just search for HSCT Publishing, or you can search for Leadership Toolbox and hit the subscribe button. Subscribing helps us grow the show. As it does with the audio, just is the same with the video. All right, that's it for me.